Welcome to the UN and Organized Crime, a podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'm Ana Paula Oliveira. In this episode, we will be discussing the different ways that human rights interplay with international frameworks to combat crime and cyber threat information sharing amongst companies. For decades, the United Nations has struggled to develop an international response to cybercrime. Negotiations for a UN Cybercrime Treaty have taken place since 2022 and are set to wrap up this July. From the beginning, states have shown different perspectives on how far and wide the powers in the treaty should go. Human rights implications and potential risks of a new norm-setting instrument in cyber have been vocalized by states and civil society alike. What human rights safeguards are helpful for cooperation? What can be used to avoid misuse? Today, I'm joined by Michael Daniel, President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Michael has substantive experience with conducting programs that improve the cybersecurity and promote cyber threat information sharing among companies and organizations in the cybersecurity field. We discuss how safeguards and human rights intersect with his work. Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about the work you do and what key safeguards that facilitated?
Sure. So, first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm always happy to try to talk about the work that we do in this space, so I'm happy to be here. I think, when you talk about what CTA does, it's important to kind of talk about it in several different ways. One is that the information that we share is about bad guy activity, meaning the information that our members are sharing with each other are specifically focused on what malicious actors are doing in cyberspace. Second, it's focused on the activity of those actors and not on victim information. In fact, we have a specific rule that says, don't send us victim information. And we have policies and procedures for if a member actually accidentally sent us that information, how we would remove it. Now, sometimes there's stuff that needs to be shared that if you worked really hard at it, you could probably trace back to a victim. But some of that is also about having a culture that what the information is to be used for, which is cybersecurity protections and detections. And then another safeguard that we build in is that we work very hard to focus on things that don't implicate antitrust concerns. So I know that's sort of out of the human rights world, but that means that we're very careful to ensure that we're protecting our members' proprietary information as well, right? That if we as CTA staff come across proprietary information, we are bound to keep that confidential, right? That we don't share that among the other members. And so we have all these kinds of rules that are built into our sharing that it makes it sound like it makes the sharing more cumbersome, but actually it makes the sharing easier because it makes very clear what is allowed to be shared. And so therefore that information can flow freely.
Thanks, Michael. It's true. Safeguards are not only limited to human rights, and we see that in the treaty negotiations as well. Issues like proprietary information are part of the discussion. One of the contentious issues of the treaty is the risk of human rights violations stemming from information sharing. Based on your experience, how do you see human rights principles and standards actually fostering cooperation and enabling trust?
I think when you are very clear about the kinds of information that need to be shared to fight cybercrime, to identify malicious activity, when you're very clear about those information requirements, you'll actually see that very little of it requires identification of victims, identification of potential victims. But I think that you can actually set aside most of these human rights concerns by clearly emphasizing that that's not the kind of information that needs to be shared. There's no reason to be sharing that kind of information in order to do cybersecurity. And I certainly think that, what the issue really comes down to is that there are many regimes around the world that perceive activity that those of us from the United States would call free speech, right? They see that as threatening. And therefore, they consider that a crime. And the truth is that just the Western world and much of the world doesn't consider that a crime. And so I think those kinds of activities. But you don't need that information to really to really do cybersecurity well. And so, there may be other places where, that kind of information is harder to make a differentiation. For example, there's an old joke that says that, to me, you're a freedom fighter. To, the other person, you're a terrorist, right? There are situations where that is true, but that is not true for the vast majority of malicious cyber activity. It's mostly criminal activity, financially motivated, designed to harm people. And you don't need the kinds of information that would implicate human rights. You simply do not need that information to fight most kinds of cybercrime.
Your point that this would be an outlier issue for cybersecurity is interesting because one of the holdups for the treaty negotiation is the desire by a group of states for a very wide list of crimes that would include this type of activity. And states will continue to discuss this at the meeting in July. The treaty also considers aspects of multi-sector engagement. Your organization's mission is to disrupt malicious cyber activity strategically and to raise the level of cybersecurity across the digital ecosystem. For that, you work a lot with partners. What principles do you think apply to multi-sector cooperation?
So one of them, we have several principles, I would say. One of them is that we work very hard to treat all of our members equitably, that we are fair among our members, that we take into account everybody's perspective, right? That we are very clear about the fact that we are going to always incorporate multiple points of view into what we do, and that we work hard to have those diverse viewpoints. And I would say that it's really about how you approach it. And I've found, interestingly enough, even across many different cultures, if you are considerate, if you bring a level of sort of, if you will, emotional intelligence and understanding and empathy to the discussion, that cuts across a lot of cultural divides. Even across many different cultural barriers, you can tell when someone is genuinely being an honest broker. And I think that comes through. And I think that leads me to my second point, which is that we acknowledge that there are different cultures and different organizational imperatives, and that we are upfront and that we embrace that. And I think that also gives people confidence. And that really leads to the third point. You really have to be that honest broker. You really have to approach it with that level of honesty and understanding. There's no sort of magic formula other than that I've found. If you find it, please let me know. But I suspect that it's not out there, right? I suspect that is part of baked into human nature, and that, we try to make that work. I guess the last thing I'll point out of this space is that we do try to be transparent about our rule set and about how we operate, so that it's very clear up front what our mission is, who our partners are. We try to, maintain that level of transparency, and that we're also not afraid to say that we do not want organizations that are not trustworthy. We do not want irresponsible organizations to be part of what we're doing. And we're very upfront about that.
The treaty also covers preventative measures. So how do you think a human rights-based approach contributes to risk identification?
I think when you take that approach, you really start to think about not just cybersecurity for the large companies, right, or large organizations, but you start thinking about, how does cybersecurity affect vulnerable populations around the world? And how do we bring cybersecurity to those populations so that, for example, we protect those populations, we better protect those populations from scams or fraud, of which they are often the target. And so I think if you take a human rights approach, you realize that access to the digital realm is a great equalizer, meaning that you can get opportunities that you would otherwise not get, educational opportunities, business opportunities, connective opportunities that you wouldn't get if you didn't have access to the digital realm. But you need to have that access to that digital realm in a secure manner, in a safe manner. And so if you think about it from a human rights standpoint, providing cybersecurity to those more vulnerable populations becomes critically important because it's such a great equalizer. Over the last couple of years, that's how I've started to think about this issue more and more.
We are also joined by Marika McAdam, an independent international lawyer and policy advisor, to discuss her experience with international treaties, specifically the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention, the GI-TOC, and its protocols. Marika, to begin with, can you tell us about your experience with international treaties? What types of safeguards have proven useful to foster trust and enable cooperation among member states? Marika, to begin with, can you tell us about your experience with international treaties? What types of safeguards have proven useful to foster trust and enable cooperation among member states?
Most of my work in this field involves the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention, so the UNTOC, and two of its three protocols in particular, being the Trafficking in Persons Protocol and the Smuggling of Migrants Protocol. So I work on different projects with a range of stakeholders, but I guess the common thread throughout my work is that I support states to give effect to their commitments in these instruments. I should also mention that there's a third protocol concerning firearms, but I can't speak to that with any authority. And that's an outlier in the sense that it relates to things, so firearms, their parts, components, and ammunition, as opposed to people. So for the ones that I work with, the Smuggling and Trafficking Protocol, human beings are the object of those crimes, meaning that human rights safeguards are, of course, central to how they have to be interpreted and implemented in practice. So it becomes really useful to read those instruments alongside standards and safeguards set out elsewhere in international law. In terms of your question about the safeguards that have proven useful to foster cooperation between states, well, international cooperation is, of course, the raison d'etre of the UNTOC and the protocols there too. So, and these instruments have definitely provided a framework and a language that the world can convene around. Human rights safeguards, I think, can help signal to states that there is a baseline in how issues are approached. Certainly that's the case with victim protection and trafficking in persons cases, though the situation is arguably a bit more complicated with respect to smuggling of migrants. But perhaps more generally and concretely, Anna, looking to the UNTOC, cooperation mechanisms like mutual legal assistance and extradition, they depend on relevant safeguards to allow states parties to put them into play. So by that, I mean things like the dual criminality requirement, whereby extradition can only be sought for an offence that is also punishable in the domestic laws of both the requesting and the requested state. And that is, of course, a critical human rights safeguard that allows cooperation between states with quite different legal systems and quite different human rights standards, because it allows states to refuse a request that would be contrary to its values. And similarly, the rule of speciality, whereby states can't take action against a person for things other than the reasons why the person was requested, that is a limit on state power, and that can guard against things like political offences or actions on discriminatory grounds. So that too is a good way of setting a safe and a fair field for international cooperation. And I think without safeguards such as those, then the international cooperation provisions in the UNTOC would certainly fall flat.
It has been argued that excessive reliance on human rights guarantees could potentially impede timely cooperation. Given that your work is broader than cybercrime and touches on the UNTOC, which has influenced these debates, can you elaborate on which standards encourage cooperation among states with different levels of rights protections?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of discussion about whether reliance on human rights can potentially impede cooperation. And I mean, I think that's an interesting thing to consider in the sense that, I think we have to agree that international law is ultimately the result of compromise between states to arrive at something that they can all get behind. And that's certainly true in the context of the UNTOC and its supplementary protocols. But I think a strong argument against the view that reliance on human rights guarantees will impede cooperation, looking at the Smuggling of Migrants Protocol. Now, there's a specific, very explicit safeguard clause in that protocol, which is Article 9, that relates to responses to smuggling of migrants at sea, which is captured in Article 8. Now, to speak really frankly on this, Anna, states have certainly entered into agreements on cooperation against smuggling of migrants at sea, but it's not apparent what role the safeguards have played in shaping or indeed curtailing that cooperation. I think the clandestine nature of actions at sea and, of course, complicated issues such as, extraterritorial jurisdiction and effective control that come from international law of the sea mean that ultimately we lack data, firstly, on whether states ever actually use Article 8 as a basis for their cooperation, but secondly, if they do, to what extent they do so in adherence to the safeguards in Article 9. My fear is that in practice, where legal safeguards run contrary to political interest or are just too inconvenient, states may simply just ignore them, and they'll pick and choose which provisions of an instrument that they want to implement and make their own interpretations of what constitutes fulfillment of minimum standards. That's, of course, disappointing, but also it's perhaps a reason for reticent states to not fear safeguards so much as they might. And it also suggests that states with quite different levels of human rights protections can still cooperate if they want to, and for better or worse. So as to which standards might encourage cooperation, I fear this may not be what you were hoping I would say. But I think all of this points to reiteration of state sovereignty as a potentially useful standard in providing assurances to states. And I think guarantees of state sovereignty may actually serve as a useful corollary or supplement to human rights and gender safeguards, particularly for those states that don't have the same resources as others to promote their agenda on the global stage and to push back against prevailing narratives of the more powerful states. So they may actually be more inclined to cooperate with others if they have assurances of sovereign equality and non-interference, including in how they pursue their international obligations.
In legal proceedings, have you seen the absence of safeguards hinder states' ability to work together? Do you have any recommendations on these issues?
I think I could answer this in different ways. And of course, I would like to say unequivocally that unless states have safeguards, particularly in relation to human rights protections, then they can't work together. But the truth is, of course, much less satisfying than this, because it's not hard to find examples of states with low or no standards cooperating on these issues. Of course, what they achieve in doing so is another matter entirely. So another way of answering this is to point out that states tend to be more comfortable to cooperate with those whom they share a history, language, legal and political culture. Therefore, agreements and adherence to a baseline of standards can be a really effective way of achieving commonality between otherwise very diverse actors. So certainly in criminal legal proceedings that I've come across that have benefited from evidence from other jurisdictions, the cooperation is generally between states that have demonstrated effective rights-based approaches, robust trial procedures, and they trust that the information, intelligence, or even resources that they share won't be misused. We can also see that responses to organised crime that are cooperative are ones that happen between states that effectively work to balance the rights of victims with due process rights to a fair trial, and that they result in better cooperation and therefore, of course, better criminal justice outcomes against crime. And conversely, where international cooperation does not happen, meaning that only very low-level offenders are prosecuted on the basis of evidence available within one jurisdiction, that lack of cooperation can be owing to a range of concerns around safeguards. For instance, where one country might be concerned that a person it considers a victim of organised crime will be treated as a perpetrator in another state, or when concerns about the application of the death penalty can arise and obstruct cooperation between states. And that, incidentally, has been raised to me as a frustration as much by states that have the death penalty as those that don't. So it could be said, I think, that where cooperation doesn't happen, it can be because of several layers of safeguards that haven't been applied in practice, ranging from rights-based victim screening processes, treatment of accused persons, and failure to apply presumption of innocence and due processes at trials. The caveat, though, Anna, that I would add is that that failure is not always owing to an absence of safeguards on paper, but the lack of resources and capacity to apply them in practice. But I still think it is fair to say that compromising on safeguards, both in paper and in practice, is to compromise on what can be achieved against organised crime. So, to get to my recommendation, if the goal is genuinely to do what it says on the tin of whatever treaty we're discussing, then safeguards can set a really useful baseline to both clarify and even to widen which states are like-minded when it comes to whatever common crime-fighting objective there is. So my recommendation then would be to keep the eye on the ball of the shared agenda, whether that's to combat transnational organised crime or to combat cybercrime, and to approach these safeguards as strategic tools to that end. And here I think the standards that are already agreed, in instruments such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, are a really solid place to start. What exists in international law, of course, needs to be alive to modern realities of evolving and complexifying crime types. But what we have already negotiated and agreed should serve as the fixed anchor point for interpreting and implementing new law, and maybe even enable states to better identify who among the international community of states are potential partners to cooperate against common threats and concerns.
Thanks so much, Marika and Michael, for sharing your perspective with us today. You've helped shed light on the relevance of safeguards in action. We'll have to see if its states can arrive at this type of common understanding or baseline, as Marika put it, as they try to wrap up the negotiations in July. The risks to human rights in the negotiations remain clear. It's now up to delegates to decide how they will handle it and what we think is the final session.